I mean, basically, I have a number of hats. One of them is as a secondary school teacher, and the other one is as an online growing sort of social media gardener as well. And what I've been able to do sort of from September this year, and actually from first lockdown last year, is really bring my two different hats and my two different personas together. So if I just tell you a little bit about sort of my background and where I'm coming from, because it does inform sort of what I'm doing in secondary schools. And even though what Emma is doing is absolutely amazing, there are quite a lot of programs out there for primary schools and growing projects, which I'm sure Emma will agree that you can tap into. Secondary schools, not so much. And there's always an assumption that secondary schools, the curriculum is just too crowded. And my point of view in terms of growing with secondary schools is from a mental health perspective. And it's purely and simply because I do believe that if you don't get those physiological needs completely in place, then the self-esteem needs and everything else just won't actually start to build. So I've been a teacher for more than 20 years. It's just suddenly counting up. Oh gosh, that's scary. And about 7 years ago, I had a complete breakdown in my mental health, complete breakdown. And it meant that even though I loved the job that I was doing, and it was related to the environment in which I was at the time, I had to leave. I had to walk away from a job that I loved and I was successful at. And as the main earner in the house, this meant that suddenly we didn't have as much money. And for the first time in my life, even though we've got young children, we found that it was really difficult to buy food. And you get this a lot. We had about £25 a week to spend on food for a family of 4, and it was tight. And I suddenly realised that buying healthy food when you have such a limited budget is really, really difficult. Now, having come from a background where my grandparents grew food, I came from a single parent family who, my mother was amazing, and we used to go foraging and we used to sort of, everything was homemade. My idea was, right, we can't afford food, I'm going to grow some. So I got myself an allotment, which at the time was quite sort of frightening, because I'd always assumed that allotments were a man's thing. So 6-7 years ago, I got myself an allotment. And what I soon realized is not only was I growing food, which meant that sort of my physiological needs and that idea that I'm going to feed my family was actually supported, but I suddenly also had this outside time, this freedom just to think. And it is so good for your mental health, because one of my basic needs was being met, and then my esteem needs started to be built up, and it built and it built and it built. Now, I then managed to get myself back into education, back into the classroom, despite the fact that it encompassed so many triggers for me. My esteem levels had been built up to the point that I could go back into the classroom. So when we had lockdown last year, one of my roles as a secondary school teacher, most secondary school teachers, is that pastoral side, and I had a tutor group. And we've been looking a lot at mental health and mental health awareness, and one of the major steps out of the 5 steps is that connect. So I was trying to think, how can I connect with my tutor group as this lockdown is going on, to make sure that they are still connected with me, I'm still connected with them, they're still connected with each other for their well-being. So what I did is I turned to my food hat and my growing hat, and I started an online growing competition with my tutor group, which soon spread to the whole school. And it was a bit, I call it my Apollo 11 moment, or Apollo 13, where I could only use what I think or thought they would have at home. Because in the first lockdown, I couldn't go out anywhere. We had to stay home. You couldn't go out and get stuff. So this was the Great Tomato Fridge Challenge. And literally getting a tomato out of the fridge, getting the seeds, getting a toilet roll tube, getting some compost, maybe, and I did say to them, ask your parents first, out of a pot in the house, putting it in. And I know at least one of you is going to be annoyed with this because it is plastic, but this is an example. And remember, this was my Apollo 13 moment. What would they have at home? And it was this kind of idea. So thinking about maybe grapes or something you get from a supermarket in one of these plastic containers, plastic bag over top to create their own mini greenhouse. Because again, they're not going to have propagators at home. So I know it's plastic, but reusing plastic, at least we have a little bit of happiness there. And what we had is every single week updating so that they could share their experiences of growing. And the winner, I have to say, grew a 6-foot tomato plant. And she beat me, even though I've got polytunnels and everything. So what was really amazing about that little project, though, is that I had so many children saying, my dad is building me something in the garden to carry on growing. And we suddenly had not only this connection between me and the children with each other, but actually with their families as well. So the families started to get involved and doing their own growing project. And in fact, the next project that came along came from one of the students who'd started to grow a pumpkin. And they challenged me to a pumpkin growing competition. And because lockdown had been going on and continuing onwards, we knew that we had lots of year sixes who would normally have the chance to come into school, feel a bit more comfortable and confident about what they were going to face, and they were missing out on that. They weren't having that transition period. And my concern was always, they're going to sort of suddenly come into the school completely raw and not feel like they're a part of the community. So we extended the pumpkin growing competition to our feeder primary schools. So videos went out, this is how you do it, this is what we're doing. And we actually got the children from the primary schools who were going to be coming up to us involved, which was really, really lovely because, and I know this was effective, simply because on the first day in September, I walked into a classroom where there was a whole load of year sevens, and suddenly I heard everyone saying, it's the pumpkin lady. Which, you know, in a secondary school, I have been called many things, and pumpkin lady is probably the best. So I will absolutely accept that. Now, what's really amazing about all this, not only have the children been growing, we've had this transition, and they've really brought into this, is my head teacher and the effect this had on her and her choices. Now, in our school, we've had an old greenhouse, a heated greenhouse that has been there for years, and it has been vacant for years. And even though in school it's not my subject, every time I walk past that greenhouse, I've just been looking at it, wondering when I could get my hands on it. Well, from September, having seen the impact, the positive impact the growing had had on a lot of the children, my head teacher finally said to me, there's a piece of land, there's the greenhouse, do a growing project. And that's exactly what I've done. So no budget, large piece of land and a group of kids. Now, with my social media hat on, I'm really, really lucky because I have a lot of contacts with a lot of big companies. So I've been able to actually get lots of donations. As I said before, in primary schools, there do seem to be pockets, if you look for them, you do have to look for them, unfortunately, where you can have funding or you have projects where they will donate things. But when it comes to secondary schools, that does dry up. There are community projects, so those of you who are interested in actually getting funding, there are community projects such as the co-op, do the community projects where you can get funding from them. But my fear at the moment is a lot of those relied on you involving the community. And in the middle of COVID, it was just something that I didn't think was realistic. So managed actually, and companies are really, really keen to help out. So again, if you're just starting up a project, it is worth asking them. So since September, I've probably managed to get about £3,000 worth of equipment donated for the growing project because we had no budget. And that's included 2 polytunnels, it's included lots of seeds and bulbs and growing equipment, welly boots, just you name it, just about we've managed to get it. Now, obviously going forward, if I'm thinking about funding in the future, then that's something that, you know, the community-based ones would be more than possible. But it is worth asking, and it is worth doing. So during this lockdown, how have I managed to actually keep these children interested? Because we've only just started it in September. They've loved the project so far. They love particularly digging, because we are starting completely from scratch. And I wanted to make sure that that enthusiasm remained. So I have actually been doing a lot of remote online gardening, which has so many tricks to it, because we're in winter, so we're sort of limited on what's growing. We're remote, so I can't actually necessarily see what they're doing or control what they're doing. But they've been brilliant. They've been absolutely fabulous. Quite a few of the children that I work with are very low income families and wouldn't necessarily have access to a lot of the items that we'd be using for the remote gardening. So little packs been made, sent out with the learning packs for those who are working on paper anyway. And they've actually been really, really engaged in it. And again, families have got involved. Constantly remembering that these are teenagers, and quite often teenagers are very different beasties to primary school children. They will disappear into their bedroom and you may not see them for days and days. But what we are seeing is photos that are coming through to me of these children working with their families, with their parents or with their grandparents on these growing projects. And that's fabulous, because it's really buying into that idea of connect, which is really part of that mental well-being and mental health. And one of them was talking about the raspberry canes and thinking about sort of the mental health and that physiological needs. They are so excited about growing food, because quite often they keep on saying, we can grow our own fruit salad, we can make our own soup. And it's just like, yes, you can. So that enthusiasm for food, but also growing the food, is just, it's so nice to see that developing.